Hello, dear friends. Welcome to another edition of HerStance. In today's episode, I want us to really imagine being in the Middle Ages before I introduce you to our next woman of history. The year is circa 1360. It's Italy, the late Middle Ages. The country is just recovering from the Black Death, a very virulent strain of the bubonic plague. Whole families are gone. In the wake of this pandemic, Christianity is intensifying. And for the first time ever, we have feelings of anxiety growing. We're thinking, perhaps I'm not obedient enough to God and to the church's practices. Will an apocalypse come again? I'm more skeptical than ever about my neighbors. Did they bring the plague? Even so, you can still get your herbs and your potions. A pagan relic is still a good precaution to take to make sure you cleanse your surroundings. The water sprites should always be thanked. Better safe than sorry. And there's still a lot of work to do, even though there are less folks to do it. The farms and the gardens need tending. The bread won't bake itself, and we love our bread. Firewood, furniture, shoes, they need to be chopped, built, and cobbled. Women are running their own households and businesses too. Spinning, weaving, needlework, cleaning, selling pastries. Women do make the world go round. Just like those bells do. Our town runs on time because those bells toll every 15 minutes for something or other, like time to pray, time to worship, announcing a wedding. Luckily, they've quieted down a bit now that the death bells are a lot less than they were before. So now you get the lay of the land. So let me introduce you to one of the most beloved young women here in Siena, Italy, under the Tuscan sun, Caterina di Jacopo di Benincasa, known today as Saint Catherine of Siena. Let's talk about her sainthood. She became a Catholic saint in 1461 by Pope Pius II. She was declared a patron saint of Rome in 1866 by Pope Pius IX, and of Italy, together with Francis of Assisi, in 1939 by Pope Pius XII. She was the second woman to be declared a doctor of the church, meaning that she has written acceptable doctrines, on 4 October 1970 by Pope Paul VI, only days after Teresa of Avila, and in 1999, Pope John Paul II proclaimed her a patron saint of Europe. That is a lot of declaration. And every April 29th, there is a feast day in her honor. But why? As we have learned in previous episodes of HerStance, the church may want us to honor her from their perspective, a perspective that we might not think is exactly flattering towards women. It wasn't then, and it certainly isn't now. So, here's her story, and you can decide for yourself. Caterina was born March 1347 in Siena, Tuscany, Italy, along with her twin, the youngest of 25 children. Most of her siblings did not survive childhood. Her father was a wealthy dye maker, and many of her male relatives were public officials, or they went into the priesthood. So she had a great deal of religious and servant leader role models to look up to. And I believe that influenced her path from a very early age. The story is told that from a very early age, as I said, and we're talking from 4 to 6 years old, she began a very rigorous prayer practice. One of her practices was to climb the stairs on her knees, reciting the Hail Mary prayer on each rung. It appeared to others as if she were floating up the stairway. She watched as her older sisters were married off, and she decided to herself to consecrate her virginity to Christ. When her sister died, her family tried to marry her off to her sister's widower. She would have been around 13 years of age at this time. So they would have the brother-in-law come around to sort of get to know her, and they tried to make her, pretty herself up. In the Middle Ages, believe it or not, they did care about what they looked like. They would have her put some makeup on, or they wanted to have her do her hair up pretty, be adorned for the brother-in-law, and she refused. In fact, she cut off all her hair so that she did not look pretty. And finally, she revealed to them that she had taken a vow of chastity, and her parents finally gave in and allowed her to stay single. During her early teen years, she experienced trances or mystic ecstasies. In Katerina's case, as learned from her writings and texts that she dictated, she had visions or waking dreams of seeing Christ vividly, transmitting a message to her or speaking directly to her. According to historian Elizabeth Petroff of Oxford University, in 1994, a book that she wrote called Body and Soul for Medieval Women, mysticism was a succession of insights and revelations about God that gradually transformed the recipient. And this would be extremely true for Katerina. She wanted to devote her life to God and to service. In 1363, she joined the Sisters of Penitence of St. Dominic in Siena. This was an order that took simple vows and lived outside of a convent. So for her first 3 years in the order, she stayed isolated in her room, seeing only her confessor, which would have been some sort of a priest, a holy man. And out of the 3 years of contemplation and prayer, she developed a rich theological system, including her theology of the precious blood of Jesus. So around 1367, she experienced a mystical marriage to Christ, in which Mary presided along with other saints, and she received a ring, which she said remained on her finger all her life. It was visible only to her, which signified the union. She practiced fasting and self-mortification, so that included self-scourging, and she took communion frequently. If you are not of a faith that takes communion, that means that she had a ritual where she would take a wafer or a piece of bread that signified the body of Christ, and then would drink a little glass of wine signifying the blood of Christ. So she did that frequently. And she also experienced the stigmata, which is signified by blood as if she had the nails of Christ from the crucifixion through her hands. And again, this was only visible to her. Finally, she set out into the world under a divine command to serve as a means of saving souls and working on her own salvation. Her visions and trances attracted a huge following among the religious and secular, both, and her advisors urged her to become active in the public and political world. Individuals and political figures began consulting her to mediate disputes and give spiritual advice. So she had a gift. She had a gift for helping folks, who were in conflict, and also offering spiritual comfort, teaching, and I would assume that would be her theology that she developed through her prayers and her solitude. So between the years 1367 and 1374, she devoted herself to helping the sick and the incarcerated of Siena. So she had, a ministry that were for the underserved, right? And with her help in the hospital of Santa Maria della Scala and within the neighborhood that she was living, Catherine's acts of charity became very well known. And this led to her being known as Santa Donna, or a holy woman. And this reputation of holiness eventually led to her involvement in politics and a hearing with the Pope. Now, this was an interesting time because this was a time in history where there was a great schism in the Catholic Church. And if you look it up, you'll also see that it was called the Papal Schism, the Great Occidental Schism, or just the Schism of 1378. And essentially, and I won't go deep into it, but essentially, it was a split within the Catholic Church that lasted from 20 September 1378 to 11 November 1417. And there were bishops that were residing in Rome, Italy, as well as Avignon, France, that simultaneously claimed to be the true pope. So we had two cities, two popes, and both claiming that they were the true pope. And they were eventually joined by a third line claiming to be the true pope in Pisa, Italy, right, in 1409. So you can imagine that this was a big issue with the Catholic Church. So Catherine decided to just throw herself assertively into the schism, and she felt that there would never be peace if they did not come to an agreement to support Rome. And she began supporting Pope Urban the Sixth in Rome. And she wrote heavily critical letters to anyone who supported the anti-pope in Avignon, France. Now, she didn't end the Great Schism, but she did work very hard to unite the faithful under Pope Urban the Sixth. She moved to Rome and preached the need for the opposition in Avignon, and knew that Italy was the only way that that peace would come to the Catholic Church, and that was what she worked tirelessly on. So we can back up just a second. She wrote heavily critical letters. Well, Catherine could not write. and she didn't have any formal education. But she did learn to read in her 20s, presumably in the Dominican order. And she obviously was very smart and gifted. So she actually dictated all of her writings. And this included about 380 letters, 26 prayers, and what are called the 4 treatises of Il Libro della Divina Dottrina, or the Dialogue. It is a very large document, and this is her record of her ecstatic experiences that illustrates her doctrine of what she calls the inner cell of the knowledge of God and of self, into which she withdrew. But at this time in her life, while dictating this amazing piece of work, she was not eating, except taking the Eucharist or communion daily. She was eating only the communion wafer and drinking the small cup of wine as ritual, nothing else. Scholars do note that this practice seems to have been a means to fully realize her love of Christ in her mystical experience, with a large proportion of her ecstatic visions relating to the consumption or rejection of food during her life. She described God as a sea in which we are the fish. The point being that the relationship between God and man should not be seen as man contending against the divine and vice versa, but as God being the endless being that supports all things. And in this interpretation, she didn't need any other nourishment. You can read the text for yourself. It is at times beautiful and at times a bit rambling, but what strikes me as key to her message has nothing to do with popes, saints, or holy rituals. There's a parable that essentially emphasizes that a life lived in love, grounded in humility and self-knowledge, is the path to true fulfillment and a life pleasing to God. But alas, she did starve her body to death. By the time that the dialogue was complete, she was extremely emaciated, and she died at 33 years old in 1380. So while Caterina's martyrdom undoubtedly garnered her sainthood, and along with all of the teachings and her writings and so forth, I believe that her potential impact on women's representation within the Catholic Church lay elsewhere. Her efforts towards healing the schism, advocating for church reform, all of that could have significantly advanced women's roles and challenged the deeply ingrained patriarchal structures that continue today. However, Caterina's story, tragically, reflects the limited choices available to women throughout history. She rejected the constraints of marriage in favor of this aesthetic devotion and service to Jesus, which was just exchanging one patriarchal institution for another. And I believe that this resonates with the struggles of many women today who feel similarly limited in their options, that they are still trapped within societal expectations that they must prioritize conformity over individual agency. They do not see themselves as able to be independent of either. And those are the women that I'm reaching out to with this series. Those who may not yet recognize the need to fight for their rightful place in a society that continues to prioritize male dominance. By challenging the deeply ingrained patriarchal structures, not just contributing to and staying marginalized, we could pave the way towards a more equitable and just society for all. Thank you for joining me once again to hear another episode of HerStance. I would love to hear what you think about St. Catherine of Siena. I'd also like to hear from you about a woman in history that you'd like to learn more about. I appreciate your listening, and I would love to have you as a subscriber. Thanks so much.